Harry Daughtry was a lawyer and a lobbyist in the first half of the 20th century. And there was one day where he was in the town of Richwood, Ohio in 1899, and he ran into a newspaper editor from the town while they were getting their shoes shined, named Warren G. Harding. Daughtry was so impressed by Harding, just at a glance, that he immediately made a decision. This man should be the President of the United States of America. It wasn't based on anything that Warren had accomplished. It wasn't based on his intellect, his charisma, or his political insight. Harry just looked at Warren and thought, that man looks like a president. And he did. Warren Harding had many of the characteristics that, like it or not, we associate with powerful people. He was a tall man with a large presence, these broad shoulders. He was imposing, but he walked gracefully for a man that was his size. He had these bright, glowing eyes, and he had a resonant, booming voice. But yet he was kind and gracious to people around him, and he was described as hard to take your eyes off of. And in that moment, it began Warren Harding's journey to becoming president in 1920, when he was sworn into the Oval Office. And he served as the president for a few years until 1923, when tragically a stroke ended his life abruptly. And he was grieved after he passed. But shortly after his death, it seemed that scandal after scandal was coming out from his time in the president's office. And the legacy of Warren Harding was called into question. He is now lauded quite widely as one of the worst presidents in the history of the United States. And he has a complicated legacy because he was a man who looked like he should be the president, but who lacked integrity. It would seem with the story of Warren Harding that the appearance of the man did not match up with the quality of the man. In his book Blink, Malcolm Gladwell calls this referring to choosing someone based on their appearance rather than their character. Malcolm calls it a Warren Harding error. But this isn't the first time in history that a Warren Harding type error has been made. In fact, it's been happening for millennia. So today we're going to look at an example and its remedy from the book of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel it's actually just part one of what's a larger book, which would be the book of Samuel. But for our modern Bible, we've broken these books up into two. And in the first few chapters of Samuel, we are introduced to a woman named Hannah. Hannah has been unable to have children until this point. And that's kind of all we know about her. We know her husband's name. She's been unable to have children, and she's in the temple one day offering her sacrifices to God, and she's just pouring her heart out as she pleads to God for a child. And so she's praying fervently for a son, saying that if she would just be granted one, she would dedicate it back to the Lord. And she's praying with this anguish, but no words are coming out. And Eli spots her. Eli is the high priest and the judge of Israel at the time. And he approaches her thinking that she's drunk, and he goes to rebuke her for being drunk in the temple. But long story short, Hannah is granted a son. She clears up that she was not drunk that day, and she names him Samuel, and she dedicates him back to the Lord. And so Samuel actually is raised by this priest Eli in the temple doing the Lord's work, so that one day he could fulfill the role of becoming a priest and a prophet for the nation of Israel. Very early in his life, Samuel is called by God amidst a situation with Eli's sons that proved that Eli and his descendants were not going to be worthy of being in charge of the nation of Israel. God has removed them, and he ends up putting Samuel in their place. But before we continue on in that story, I want to look at what Hannah prayed when she had Samuel and dedicated him to the Lord. So this is 1 Samuel, and it's in the 2nd chapter. And there's this prayer or a song there. And so we're going to look at verses 3 and 4 and verse 8. Stop acting so proud and haughty. Don't speak with such arrogance. For the Lord is a God who knows what you have done. He will judge your actions. The bow of the mighty is now broken, and those who stumbled are now strong. Those who were well fed are now starving, and those who were starving are now full. For all the earth is the Lord's, and he has set the world in order. So the theme of what we're looking at in 1 Samuel today really is shown in this passage here. It talks about pride and arrogance. It's talking about a God who knows what we've done and who we are. And so Hannah is saying that God sees who we are and what we do. And he knows that when we are being proud and arrogant. And the whole book of Samuel shows us first, over and over, the consequences of when we act this way. So let's go back to Eli's sons. What were they doing? Well, it says that they were disrespectful to the sacrifices that were brought to the Lord. So people would bring sacrifices to the temple, and Eli's sons would actually demand that they get portions of those sacrifices just to eat for themselves. They were sexually promiscuous in the temple, and they would lie, they would steal, they would cheat, and God ultimately deemed them unfit for work in his temple. And God said that he was planning their demise and to replace them with the young boy, Samuel. And Eli was apparently oblivious to what was happening with his sons for a long time. He was well along in years at this point. It said he had lost his sight, but God knew, and God revealed it to Eli and to Samuel, and eventually justice was carried out. God takes that position of authority from Eli's sons and he hands it over to Samuel, because the Lord is a God who knows what we have done. And this is our first look really at God opposing the proud and exalting the humble in this book. He removes the sons who were opposing them, who were opposing him, and brings in Samuel. And so what is the difference here that a godly person makes? Because Israel wasn't doing great at this time. They were worshiping idols. They were in a years-long feud with the Philistines. Life wasn't necessarily easy in the nation of Israel. And not right away, but eventually things do start to get better in Israel. With Samuel at the helm, they throw out their idols. They throw out all these false gods. And all of the people begin to serve the one true God. And they start to win battles against the Philistines. In fact, in 1 Samuel 7, verse 13, it says, "So the Philistines were subdued and didn't invade Israel again for some time. And throughout Samuel's lifetime, the Lord's powerful hand was raised against the Philistines." So with Samuel at the helm, things are much better in Israel. They are following the Lord, and they are having victory in their battles. And this isn't because we have record of Samuel being some great warrior or a general. No, he was a humble servant and a prophet and a judge who served well, who was righteous, and who brought peace to the land of Israel. Until decades later, we have a similar situation. Samuel grows to be an older man, and when he no longer has the energy to function as the judge over Israel, much like Eli, he makes the mistake of appointing his sons to be the judges, and they once again do a bad job. He appoints his sons who are unqualified, who are not walking in righteousness the way that Samuel was. And once again, Israel begins to struggle. So Israel's had enough, and they begin to request a king. And so the people approach Samuel as this elder in the nation, and they say they want to be like all the other nations around them. They don't want to be dictated by these bad priests and judges. They want a king like all the other, more like grown-up and established nations. And Samuel hesitantly grants the request. And so shortly after, Samuel meets Saul. And this is how we're introduced to Saul. This is really interesting. 1 Samuel 9, verse 2. Kish's son Saul was the most handsome man in Israel, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the land. That might seem familiar to some of us. Samuel and the nation of Israel are about to make a Warren Harding error. They have taken someone who just looks like he could be a king, who when they go out into the battlefield, people would say like, wow, they got a good king. That guy looks like he should be leading a nation. And what ends up happening is a familiar story. But to be honest, it actually goes well for a while with Saul. He has some victories, he has some good moments early on, but it starts to go south fairly quickly. Just a few chapters after he is appointed king, we see the breaks begin to happen in Saul's case. So they're waiting to fight the Amalekites. And part of the tradition of the Israelites going to war at that time was that before they would go to war, they would have the high priest come and he would sacrifice before the Lord. They would worship God and then they would go to battle. And so Samuel is a very old man at this point, and they're waiting for Samuel to come to make a sacrifice, but Saul is getting really, really impatient. Because he's seeing that military-wise, they are losing an advantage over their enemies. He doesn't want to be waiting with these men anymore. And so instead of waiting for Samuel to get there, he makes the sacrifice himself. And so they make the sacrifice, they go out, they win the battle, and Saul comes back probably feeling on top of the world until he's confronted by Samuel. Samuel rebukes him and tells him that God has rejected him as the king of Israel. Just like that. It seems that Samuel announces to Saul that God no longer wants him to have the throne. And this might seem like a rushed decision on Samuel's part, but God was angry at Saul for just the callousness and the lack of trust that he had in God, for his disobedience. And he was angry that Saul was refusing to trust God, that he was proud, that he was arrogant. So God leads Samuel away from Saul to find the next king, out to the tribe of Benjamin to find a man named Jesse. And when he encounters Jesse, he sees that there's going to be a son of Jesse's that is going to be the next king appointed over Israel. And Samuel basically walks in, and right away he makes another one of these Warren Harding errors. He sees Jesse's oldest son and goes, that guy has got to be the Lord's anointed. He's got to be the one. Look at how tall and handsome he is. He just looks like a king. As if we haven't just done this. But God responds to Samuel in chapter 16, verse 7, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And so Samuel goes all the way down the line of Jesse's sons, and he finds out that the one who God has anointed isn't even present. They didn't even bring him to meet with Samuel. It's this young boy David who is currently tending to sheep out in a pasture somewhere, and they wait for David to be brought, and when he comes, Samuel is told by God, that's the one. That is the one I've anointed to be the next king over Israel. And David at the time, he's too young. Might have been a little awkward. Probably didn't smell great. And there's no reason at the time to believe that David should be the king of an entire nation, yet God chooses him. Because God's not looking at the outward appearance, God sees what's happening in David's heart. And so with all that, with the contrast between Eli and Samuel and Saul and David, I want to look at situations where we can see the difference that a godly person can make. So there's two situations. First is that Saul, knowing that the kingdom has been taken from him, knowing that he's still the king over these people, he begins to decline pretty quickly. It's documented that he would just have a tormented spirit and soul, and just his mind would be uneasy, and he didn't know what to do. And eventually, of all the people for them to bring to him, David is brought to him, because David is a musician And when David plays, it seems to soothe Saul's spirit. And this position that David is put in, it ends up leading to him having the ability to go to Saul when the Israelites encounter another battle. One of the most famous stories, not even just in the Bible, but like in all of storytelling, is this next one, is the story of David and Goliath. Goliath is this champion of the Philistines, and he's provoking the Israelites to bring out one person, just one person, to have a duel with him. And whoever walks away will be the champion. And that nation will be claimed victorious. And David walks into that situation. He sees that none of the Israelites are stepping up, and he's like, what are we doing here? Do you guys not know that we're God's chosen people? Do you not know that we can defeat Goliath, even though he's a giant who's like 9 feet tall? We can surely defeat this man. So having this position, he's able to go to Saul and say, I'm going to fight Goliath. And I think Saul probably doubts him a little bit. But David knows that he has everything that he needs. Speaking of Malcolm Gladwell, who we talked about earlier, he has a fascinating TED Talk that you can find online about why David wasn't necessarily walking in as empty-handed as we might think. But certainly he was unqualified, and he was not somebody who had the resume to go out and fight a battle. But David knows that with a sling and with a few stones, he has everything that he needs because God is on his side. And so the giant taunts him, and David rushes towards him, and he flings his sling, and a stone comes out, and it impacts Goliath right in the forehead. It knocks him out, knocks him over, and David takes Goliath's own sword to win the battle. A godly person walks into that situation with full confidence, knowing that God has given him everything he needs, and he experiences victory that day. And David goes on to become a mighty warrior in the nation of Israel, and eventually people can be heard singing, Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. And Saul begins to get jealous as he realizes that David is the next anointed one over Israel, and David is being given all this favor from God that seems to be absent in his own life, and he begins to pursue David. He wants to kill David. He wants to eliminate him because he's jealous and because he's angry, and so he begins to pursue David all over the countryside, all over the wilderness. And David has these men, and they're holed up in caves all over the country as the king tries to capture him. And so there's another situation where they're in these caves, and the caves there are not like what we might think of as a typical cave where it's like 10 feet deep and you kind of walk in, you see the end, and then you walk out. Like these were like intricate, deep caves. And David and his men seem to be all the way at the back of one. And Saul goes to the entrance of the cave to relieve himself one day. And David has a chance. Saul has no idea he's there. David had the chance to get his revenge on his enemy here. But David recognizes that as long as Saul is alive, he is God's anointed one, and he honors him. So he cuts off a piece of Saul's robe instead as a mark that he has given Saul grace in this situation, and Saul realizes it. But nothing really changes. What David shows us over and over is that despite human evil, God is still working out his purposes. David extends grace to Saul, and Saul continues to chase him. Saul continues to be angry with him. And David lives for a long time under this like feeling of persecution and of powerlessness, where it seems like only God is working on his side, but God is faithful to work out his purposes in David's life. And David's legacy, what the life of David ultimately points to, is that God blesses David and all the generations to follow him. And so there's this lineage of kingship that goes right to Jesus. Jesus ends up being a direct descendant of David. And so we see the godly character has walked into so many situations, and it has trusted that God is faithful, that God is on his side, and there are blessings that are experienced that go beyond the life of David, that go into the generations beyond him. And now we're able to say that David was a descendant of Jesus. And so as I close today, I want to give you the challenge today. What kind of person are you? Because Jesus didn't die for us to be proud. He didn't die for us to be arrogant. He didn't die for us to make rash decisions. In fact, what he said in Luke chapter 9, verse 23, he said to all of the people there, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up their cross daily and follow me." Follow me. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. So as we follow Jesus, the goal is to act and look and behave more like Jesus. We're not following his directions, we're following his life and who he was here on earth. So who is this Jesus that we are following? Jesus was patient. He was kind. He was full of love and compassion for those around us, and he was led by the Spirit. People enjoyed being around Jesus. You know how I know that? Because when Jesus feeds 5,000, it's not like he walked into an arena of hungry people and goes, "Oh, you need to be fed," and then feeds them. No, he attracted 5,000 people. People liked being around Jesus. There was something about him that brought people together. So for following Jesus, there needs to be something in us that's different than the world around us. We are super divided today. In pretty much every area of life, there's division. And people argue, and they draw hard lines, and they take hard stances. But what we see in the life of Jesus is that he didn't separate people. He actually brought them together. And he pointed towards a better and a greater way of living. He pointed towards the kingdom of heaven being here on the earth. But unlike David, being a godly person doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to be made king. In fact, I can almost guarantee you that you're not going to be made king. God doesn't promise that he will give you all the riches and splendors that this world has to offer if you're righteous. That part comes later. Our reward comes in heaven. Not here on earth, but in heaven. But just like the way that we see that Eli's sons and Saul's sins had consequences, I believe that our righteousness also has consequences. So what's the difference that a godly person can make? When you show up to a situation as a righteous person, what is going to result from that? What's going to happen because you did that? Well, I would say first that they calm situations. In Mark chapter 4, verse 35 to 41, we see a story of Jesus being in a boat. And he's with his disciples, and they're traveling across this lake when a storm starts. And Jesus is sleeping in the front of the boat, and the disciples are panicking. They think they're going to get thrown overboard. They're going to lose their ship in this storm. And they call upon Jesus and say, like, "Jesus, you have to help us." And Jesus just says, "Quiet, be still." And the storm around them calms. And the waters calm, and the rain goes away. The difference that a godly person can make in a situation is that they can walk into the most turbulent times and be a presence that calms those around them. You might have situations in your life that are rough. You might have people around you who are fighting. There might be There might be drama that you're caught up in. There might be family issues that are unresolved and that are tearing people apart. But when a godly person shows up, they can bring calm to those situations. When somebody is a follower of Jesus, they can actually bring like the presence of God into a situation, and they can bring a peace and a calm into that space. They also heal. They calm situations and they can heal situations. Matthew 5, verse 6 says, God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied. It's from the NLT. Some other translations will have righteousness, but it's getting at the same thing. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied. This past year and even this past week has taught a lot of us that there is a lot of justice that needs to be done. Just this past week, with what came out from Kamloops, BC, we see that there is a need for justice in our world. That there are wrongs that have not yet been set right. And some there really never can be, but the Bible teaches us that justice can and should be done. I see so much, looking at the story of the Bible, I see so much of an emphasis on God wanting justice to be done here on earth. It's a recurring theme over and over and over. And I pray that the church never loses its way. And if they ever do, that they find it quickly in bringing justice into this world. I believe that we are to be people who are agents of change for that. And so how do we do that? Well, I think as we follow Jesus, we should look like Jesus. And what do we see him do so often? We see somebody who is struggling in life. We see somebody who is blind or is sick or is deaf or is possessed by demons, and they approach Jesus. And so often what we see, like, for example, when the centurion approaches Jesus, he says, Jesus, my servant is sick and he's dying and I need you to come help him. So Jesus listens to him, and then he goes and he brings healing to that situation. I think listen, take action, and heal. Those are great steps for us as believers, to be godly people stepping into situations. And listening to our brothers and our sisters and our friends who need help today, who need justice. And as we go, I just pray that we would be people who take action and who bring healing into situations. That we would look like Jesus here on the earth. So that's my challenge to you today. As we go, as we remember these stories of how David and Samuel were able to bring a shift in how things happened here on earth. And they were able to bring a shift to an entire nation of Israel through their righteousness. I believe that God is calling the church to do the same today. I believe that God is calling the church to be people who are righteous and who calm and who heal and who act on the behalf of justice and righteousness. So it's my challenge to you today that you would go out and that you would look like Jesus. And if you have not ever decided to become a follower of Jesus, I just want to open that invitation to you today. If you want to learn more about it, or if you want to know how you can accept Jesus, I would encourage you to message us on Facebook or go to our website, and that's going to be in the link below. And you can find ways to get connected with us and to talk about that. And for all the rest of us, I want to pray today as we close our service. So God, I just pray that in a world that is so broken, that is so far from you, that needs you so badly, God, that we as your church, that we would rise up, that we would take action, that we would be listening for those who need some justice and righteousness in their lives. And that we would go into situations and that we would calm those storms, and that we would bring healing, that we would bring life, and that we would be a reflection of who you are, Jesus. God, help us to look more like you. In your name we pray. Amen.
Well, thank you, Scott, for a good word today from the book of 1 Samuel. Thank you for the challenge and the encouragement and the good teaching. And we want to thank you for joining with us. It's always good to have you. We know that there are other things you could be doing, but you have instead joined with us in worshiping God and hearing from His Word. And we hope that you come back again next week as we continue our series on Cover to Cover. And we hope to see you next week. God bless you.